The city was a scar on the earth. Towering structures scraped the sky, their metal surfaces eternally stained with grime. The air was thick, a noxious blend of smoke and decay. They called it progress. He called it a cage. Born into this world, Marcus knew no other life. Survival was the only law. Food was scarce, resources scarcer. The solution? They called it recycling. The ultimate taboo shattered, consumed by necessity. Humanity, the predator, became the prey. Marcus, like everyone else, had accepted this gruesome reality, until now. The processing plant was a symphony of horror. Metal shrieked, blades whirred, and the relentless hum of machinery filled the air. The walls, once a sterile silver, were now stained with the remnants of countless lives. The floor, slick with blood, told tales of agony and despair. The stench of blood and fear clung to the air, a nauseating blend that assaulted the senses. It was a place where hope came to die, where dreams were crushed under the weight of cold, unfeeling steel. Marcus worked mechanically, his spirit dulled by the daily carnage. Each movement was precise, practiced, devoid of any emotion. He had long since learned to shut off his mind, to become a mere extension of the machines he operated. He was a cog in the machine, desensitized to the terror that fueled the city. The faces of the victims blurred together, becoming an indistinguishable mass of suffering. He had to detach himself to survive. Each day, new stock arrived. Men, women, children. They were herded in like cattle, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. They knew what awaited them, and yet they had no choice but to march forward. Their faces, etched with terror, were seared into Marcus's memory. He could see them even when he closed his eyes, haunting his dreams, turning them into nightmares. But he couldn't afford to dwell on them. He tried not to see, not to feel. Empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford. To care was to invite madness, to open the door to a flood of emotions that could drown him. So he built walls around his heart, fortified them with indifference. He had to remain stoic, detached, a silent observer in a world gone mad. It was the only way to keep his sanity intact, to keep the darkness at bay. But today, something was different. Amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces, there was one that stood out. A face in the crowd, a flicker of recognition. It was a face he knew, a face he had once loved. His heart skipped a beat, a surge of emotion breaking through his carefully constructed barriers. It was a face he thought he would never see again. A face that brought back memories of a time before the grind. The shock of recognition was like a jolt to his system. He felt the walls around his heart begin to crumble, the indifference he had so carefully cultivated starting to erode. He couldn't afford to let his emotions take over, but the sight of that familiar face made it impossible to remain detached. He had to make a choice, to continue as he had, a cog in the machine, or to let the flicker of recognition ignite something within him. The grind had taken so much from him, but perhaps, just perhaps, it hadn't taken everything. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The grind was relentless, but so was he, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope, a spark that maybe, just maybe, he could reclaim a piece of his humanity. Panic seized him. His blood ran cold. He felt a chill run down his spine, freezing him in place. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was as if the world had stopped, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. It couldn't be, not her. His eyes darted around, hoping he was mistaken, that it was someone else, but deep down he knew. He recognized her instantly, despite the years that had passed. But there she was, his sister, her eyes wide with terror, her small frame dwarfed by the guards surrounding her. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable. Memories of their childhood flooded back, moments of laughter and innocence now tainted by the harsh reality before him. He hadn't seen her in years. not since she was a child. They had been separated by circumstances beyond their control, each forced to navigate a world that had grown increasingly cruel and unforgiving. Now she was just another piece of meat. The thought was unbearable, a knife twisting in his gut. How had it come to this? How had the world allowed such atrocities to become the norm? His heart pounded against his ribs. Each beat was a reminder of the urgency, the need to act. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not when his sister's life was at stake. He had to do something. The resolve hardened within him. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. He had to find a way to save her, no matter the cost. He had to save her. The plan began to form in his mind, each step fraught with danger but necessary. He couldn't afford to fail. Her life depended on it. The thought of her being processed, turned into food for the masses, was unbearable. The very idea made his stomach churn. He had to stop it, to prevent the unthinkable from happening. He had to get to her. But how? The facility was heavily guarded, a fortress designed to keep people out. But he couldn't let that deter him. He had to find a way in, to reach her before it was too late. The clock was ticking and every second counted. The gears in his mind turned, searching for a way out, a flicker of hope in the abyss. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but giving up was not an option. Every second counted, and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. He had to think fast, but more importantly, he had to think smart. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of machinery, a constant reminder of the oppressive environment he was trapped in. His eyes darted around, taking in every detail, every possible escape route. He couldn't afford to miss anything. He couldn't confront the guards. They were too many, too well armed, and too vigilant. A direct confrontation would be suicide. He had seen what happened to those who tried to fight back. It wasn't pretty. The guards were ruthless, trained to deal with any threat swiftly and without mercy. He needed a different approach, something they wouldn't expect. He needed to outsmart them, to use their own strengths against them. But how? He had to be smart. He had to think outside the box, to come up with a plan that was as daring as it was ingenious. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. His mind raced, considering and discarding possibilities at lightning speed. He needed a plan that would allow him to move undetected, to blend into the shadows and slip past the guards without raising any alarms. It was a tall order, but he was determined to make it work. He had to blend in, use the very system that held her captive against itself. The facility was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more secure than the last, but he knew it inside out. He had studied it, memorized every detail, every security measure. He knew where the cameras were, where the guards patrolled, and where the blind spots were. He could use this knowledge to his advantage, to move through the facility without being seen. He would become a ghost, invisible to those who sought to stop him. He would become her savior, her only hope. There was a way, a dangerous way, the ventilation system. It was risky, but it was their best chance. The ducts were narrow, dark, and filled with obstacles, but they offered a way to move through the facility without being seen. He would have to navigate them carefully, avoiding any sensors or traps that might be hidden within. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. He had to make it work. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. He couldn't afford to think about the risks, about what might go wrong. He had to focus on the task at hand, on getting to her and getting them both out of there. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. He had to be. There was no turning back now. He had to time it perfectly, navigate the labyrinthine network of ducts, and reach her before it was too late. Every second counted. He moved quickly but carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. The ducts were cramped and claustrophobic, but he pushed through, driven by the thought of her waiting for him. He couldn't let her down. He had to succeed. The fate of both their lives depended on it. The hours crawled by, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to his resolve. He worked mechanically, his mind consumed by the plan forming in his head. He memorized the guard rotations, the shift changes, the rhythm of the plant. As the designated hour approached, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. This was it. His chance. His heart pounded against his ribs, a drumbeat urging him forward. He took a deep breath, steeling his nerves. He had to do this. For her. Section 6. Into the abyss. The air in the ventilation shaft was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Marcus moved swiftly, his movements guided by desperation and a map etched in his mind. The darkness was all-consuming, but he couldn't afford to be afraid. The clang of machinery echoed through the ducts, a constant reminder of the horrors below. He pushed forward, his body aching, his lungs burning. He had to reach her. He had to reach her in time. Section 7. The escape. He found her in a holding cell, her eyes dull with fear. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here to get you out." Her eyes widened in disbelief, a flicker of hope igniting in their depths. He had to get them both out of this hellhole. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and fear. They ran through the shadows, the screams of the damned echoing behind them. They were almost there, almost free. Section 8. A horrifying truth. They emerged into the cold night air, gasping for breath, but their relief was short-lived. As they stumbled away from the plant, the city's skyline came into view. And that's when Marcus saw it. A horrifying truth that chilled him to the bone. The city, their entire world, was shaped like a giant skull. The buildings weren't buildings at all. They were bones. They had been living within the belly of the beast all along. Section 9. Twisted revelation. His blood ran cold. He finally understood. The truth hit him like a physical blow. There was no escape. They weren't recycling humans. They were feeding them. Feeding something far more sinister. And he had just delivered his own sister into its jaws.